Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good evening.
Good morning. All good.
There's always one.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. It's Mayedwa this side. For the time being, while we are still waiting for others, for those who are not able to fill in the survey, I've just shared the link on the chat. I would like you guys to click on it and fill it in, and it will take you less than 5 minutes to actually fill that particular link. We will just be waiting for others for the next 8 minutes to come, and thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Francisco Daams here. Good to be part of this.
Morning, Francisco. Thank you for joining us.
Morning, Martina here.
Good morning. Those who just recently joined, please fill in the survey that I've shared on the chat box. All that you need to do is just to click on the link, and we'll be starting shortly in the next 3 minutes. If ever you haven't filled the form, please fill it. Thank you so much.
Morning. I see a hand up. From Desiree Titus's PC.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mayedwa, the Volunteer Director from Lifesaving South Africa. I'm heading the portfolio of drowning prevention. Well, my job is very simple, is to welcome you all and thank you all for attending. We'd like to welcome you. And this is a series of community development and sustainable in flood disaster management workshop. And without wasting more time, I see there is still a number of people that are actually attending. I would like to welcome you, all of you, for attending. In our records, we have a number of people that actually are in attendance, starting from our guests who will be presenting, Mr. Francisco Adams from the Western Cape Disaster Management, as well as Dr. Shayne from National Education and Training and RLSSA in Australia, as well as Andre. And we have also Emmy, Dr. Emmy, who is also a researcher. She will only just be an observer today. She's not presenting anything. But nevertheless, we would like to thank you and welcome you all. And we have a number of members that have attended. And I would like to just to recognize within our midst the current president of ILS Africa, who's with us, Mr. Muhammad Ali. Thank you for your attendance, and I would like to also extend the warm welcome for a number of all other organizations that are here from our neighboring countries, as well as as far as in India. We have a number of delegates, international NGOs, the members from the neighboring countries, and members within the African continent, as well as the local municipalities that are in attendance. And without wasting much more time, I would like to call on Dr. Shayne Baker, who will just give us an overview as to why are we having these particular sessions, the importance of these particular sessions. Just a brief overview of who Dr. Shayne Baker is. Dr. Shayne Baker is a National Education and Training Advisor for the Royal Lifesaving in Australia, also a member of International Lifesaving Rescue Commission. Shayne is an experienced lifesaver and drowning prevention advocate and educator that has been involved in drowning prevention strategies at the local, national, and international level. During his career, he has been a learner, a teacher, a national president of RLSSA, an active volunteer beach lifeguard, an examiner of other wanting to become a lifesaving throughout Australia. So Shayne has contributed to the development of drowning prevention knowledge and is an active presenter and a delegate at local and national and international conferences on educational initiatives, on strategies as well as programs. He has been honored through the Queen's Honour System with an Order of Australian Medal, and in 2017 he was awarded an Island Medal. Complementing these initiatives, he's a member of Lifesaving Foundation in Ireland, an honorary member in the Philippine Lifesaving Society, a director of Royal Lifesaving South Africa Commonwealth, and the member of International Drowning Research. So I would like to give over to him. He will just give us an overview, and thereafter, Mr. Francisco will take over in terms of the presentation. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Shayne.
Thank you so much, Mizzy. It's really a great honour to be able to join in with my colleagues and with all the people that you've introduced today and for this very first session. Just as a quick background, Adrian and I started to, I guess, try to ignite the interest and a passion for the impact of drowning. And when we came over to the World Conference in 2019, there had been a significant flooding event in Mozambique. So that the timing, we weren't there to actually help, but we were certainly there at a time when the topic was very fresh in a lot of people's minds. Similarly, I thought, just as an introduction, I grabbed just this today because, as some of you may be aware, our country's just been through some significant flood events across the eastern part of our continent. And as we've seen, fortunately, the loss of life has been quite small, but the damage to infrastructure is still to be assessed, but it's estimated to be quite significant. And I found this article today from Joel Gurgis from the Australian National University, and who had grabbed this etching from 1867. And two of those rivers are two of the rivers that have featured this week, the Hawkesbury and the Nepean rivers, which come together and where there's a massive floodplain. And one of the learnings, apart from the fact that there's this urbanisation demand for land, there's talk about putting 130,000 people in those floodplains, which most of us would probably be sitting there going, well, that would not be the smartest decision that any government could make. But I like the etching. I think the etching is so dramatic in terms of those floods. In actual fact, that flood in 1867 was actually the highest recorded in that area. It was just over 19 metres, whereas the flood this week got to 13 metres. So it was another 6 metres in depth. So, but I think one of the things we need to sort of be aware of, I'm not sure how I progress that slide, do I? I say, that's what I do. That contains some of the details there, and it refers to the climate change. And one of the things I thought that was important, just as a introduction to everybody and to help us focus, because what we're seeing here is no different than what's happening across the globe. We're seeing that there is warming of our waters, and in this particular case, since 1910, when records were first captured here, our overall climate has increased by 1.4 degrees Celsius. And the scientists within the group can probably affirm to us that with every 1 degree of warming, the lower atmosphere that controls and basically influences our weather patterns has a increase of its capacity to hold water by 7%. So for every 1 degree, we got 7% more capacity to hold water. And what the other part of that is that as the oceans are also warming, that means the evaporation rates will make our wet seasons, as and when they happen, much wetter than usual. And in fact, one part of our area this week was getting 200 millimetres of rain for nearly 5 days consecutively. So even though there's parts of our country that do experience a wet season, what we've been experiencing now is just phenomenal. So a warmer atmosphere will hold more moisture, and the changes that we're seeing indicate that events will become more intense. Next slide, please. So just as a graphic, because I realise that some people may not understand my Australian English, and if you think I'm bad, wait till Adrian starts. But the slide on the left shows that previously we've had a pattern, and the one on the right shows quite clearly as that temperature in the thermometer increases, we're going to see more evaporation into the atmosphere, and then we're going to see more rainfall. So again, reinforcing the pattern that we're starting to see across the globe. Next slide, please. So I grabbed this also. This is actually, and for those that haven't completed the survey, I hope you do, because we want to use that information. But this is actually taken from the Sendai document, and it's urgent and critical to anticipate, plan for, and reduce disaster risk in order to more effectively protect people, communities, and countries. So to me, that really captures a fair bit of our motivation, because as predominantly as lifesavers, we are concerned with the drowning. And at this stage, we don't believe there has been enough emphasis placed on how we can respond, assist, and contribute to the effort that's needed across the globe. So our request of people to provide some survey is that from our initial workshop, we have some common themes that we will explore as we go along, but we also want to hear from all of the vast representatives and different organisations that we know are here this morning, from local government, from emergency service personnel, from life-saving organisations. So we actually want to make this something that is going to perhaps build that knowledge and build those connections. And final slide, please. Oh, that was it?
That's it.
Oh, okay. Okay, so before I hand over back to Mizzy for the introduction for Francesco, we are keen to also have input, and we appreciate that Francesco's joined us to lead off the session today, and then and provide some questions and answers. And we also will value the input that everyone else can provide. And I'll say a little bit more later when we get into our main presentation. So over to you again, Mizzy.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please, if ever you have any questions, we would like you to make use.
Thank you, guys. I'm very sorry for that. To wait for 2 more days.
Francisco, let me introduce you first so that the members may know who we are talking to.
Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Francisco is currently a Deputy Director under the Western Cape Provincial Disaster Management, heading the Unit of Risk and Mitigation. Mrs. Adams' background started with the incidents of management in Mossel Bay in 2015, after he has completed his BSc Honours in the Disaster Risk Science at the University of Cape Town. Following a year-long spell working at the Disaster Mitigation for Sustainable Livelihoods program at UCT as a researcher and a short course administrator, his career as a disaster management began as an assistant disaster risk management officer at the Disaster Risk Management Center at the City of Cape Town in January in 2019. And later in October 2019, Mr. Adams was then employed as the Assistant Director at the Western Cape Disaster Management Center, and he was promoted to become a Deputy Director responsible for disaster mitigation in 2012. His responsibilities include supporting municipalities to develop disaster risk reduction measures, as well as training, education, awareness, research and marketing activities for the overall improvement of disaster management functions in the Western Cape. Mr. Francisco, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning to all connected. It is a pleasure to be here. Can I just get a confirmation that everyone can see the presentation?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. I just would like to add the one thing I left out of my bio is that I used to be a lifeguard myself in 2005 at the Mossel Bay Surf Lifesaving Club. I spent 2 seasons there on the beach, and it's something I truly have fond memories of and miss a lot. So this is something close to home for me as well, to be able to present to my fellow past colleagues here. Anyways, moving on to matters at hand, I've been requested to provide a brief overview of disaster management in the Western Cape, and with a thematic focus on floods. So just starting off, let's see if this changed. Yes, starting off, just for those who do not know, the disaster management structures in South Africa, we have a National Disaster Management Center located in Centurion, Gauteng, and then each of the 9 provinces have provincial disaster management centers. Here in the Western Cape, our disaster management center is located with the emergency medical services, and together we form what is known as a provincial emergency management center. And below us, we have 6 regional disaster management centers on the district municipal level. And in terms of the Disaster Management Act, the national, provincial, and district spheres of government must all have disaster management centers. Each of the districts have a few local municipalities below them, in total 24. And there's also the Metro City of Cape Town. On the provincial level, we are obviously linked to any other state departments on the national or provincial level, as well as our parastatals, South African Police Service, and South African National Defence Force. Just a brief internal structure of the Western Cape Disaster Management Center. We are a chief directorate in the Department of Local Government, and we have 2 main components, namely the Directorate for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is where I fall under. We are responsible for doing a range of things, namely the risk assessments, disaster interventions, early warnings, and the GIS. And my portfolio specifically is training, education, marketing, awareness, as well as development and developmental disaster risk reduction support offered to municipalities. The other Directorate of Disaster Operations, they're responsible for preparedness and response planning and all contingency planning support to stakeholders. They have a section that deals with all recovery and rehabilitation. And lastly, they have a unit that deals with any intergovernmental relations, which is key to ensuring institutional arrangements are in place. Last but not least, we also have the Fire Brigade, Fire Rescue Services on the provincial level, who to a large part are responsible for the aerial firefighting resources we use in our fire season. Moving on to the matters at hand, here is a snapshot of the Western Cape province. As you can see, we have the districts and the metro there. And as you can see with the image from our provincial risk assessment or the provincial risk profile, flood risk is prevalent in the Western Cape, but largely limited to the catchment areas in terms of riverine flooding. And in the metropole of Cape Town, we have an area known as the Cape Flats with a high water table, which is very susceptible to ponding and pooling when there's a lot of heavy rain, which we get in winter. Here is an example of one of the tools we use to model and plan for certain hazards, for example, like flood risk. So what we've done here, we've got the flood risk overlaid over one of the towns on the coast, and we have various data sets of infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and etc. And the idea of this web-based decision support tool, which we publish and give access to all of our municipalities, is to inform not only proactive planning in the form of risk reduction projects and programs, but also to inform critical decision-making whilst in the process of responding to and managing a flood incident. Moving on to early warnings, there has been a transition from weather warnings that would tell you what the weather will be to what the weather will do. What this means is severe weather warnings would issue an example of 50 to 60 millimeters of rain in a certain area. And it was determined that by and large, the public did not understand or were able to perceive the material impact of what 50 or 60 millimeters of rain may do. So what has been developed was an impact-based system where the potential consequences and the likelihood of the impact is part of the narrative as opposed to just the meteorological information. Just for everyone to note, very importantly, the South African Weather Service is the only legally mandated authority in South Africa responsible for the determination and distribution of impact-based severe warnings. This obviously in conjunction with the disaster management centers. So who play a crucial role in ensuring that these warnings are disseminated to a broader range of stakeholders to ensure that they can take the necessary steps to avoid or reduce the risk and prepare for an effective response. Here's just a diagram of how the early warning system is linked to our provincial risk profile. This profile has identified risk owners, and when the early warning is issued by the South African Weather Service, it is issued via the Provincial Disaster Management Center, where we combine two sets of global address lists to ensure that all stakeholders from the district and local and level, and ultimately the affected public, receive these impact-based messages. Here's an example of the impact scale that is used in terms of the likelihood and the impact. The color coding as well as the numbering is determined by combining the level of impact with the likelihood of that impact occurring. This means that the forecaster will decide the possible impact could be as a result of a certain hazard, in this case, rainfall, for example, with input from the local disaster management. So what is interesting here, we've got forecasters who, due to a lot of work with disaster managers, are now able to forecast the impact from a disaster risk point of view, which has become very useful for the stakeholders when receiving these messages, and most notably the public. In terms of the Disaster Management Act and what it specifically says in terms of flooding, it makes provision for the response and the coordination of a flood incident at the local level, either at the district or metro level. That is in terms of legislation. Should that exceed the ability of the local authority to deal with the flood, it will then be escalated to the provincial level. The legislation further provides that all role players from all spheres of government, they must develop preparedness and response plans for priority threats as identified in the risk assessment. In our case, at the Provincial Center, we have a Provincial Preparedness Response and Relief Plan, which is known as the generic plan. It is utilized for all generic responses in the province, which includes floods. Example, the activity of erecting a roadblock by a provincial traffic remains the same whether it's for flood or fire. And the next slide will explain this. So in this case, here's a page for an example of activities required for flooding. And it's quite user-friendly. It basically has all these prompting questions, and then it has suggestions based on what your answers are, and then based on the fields that you enter, one can easily determine what actions need to be taken to manage the incident. So what we do as well is that we liaise with all stakeholders at least 2 to 3 months prior to the commencement of the winter season to ensure a state of winter readiness. This includes Lifesaving Western Cape as well as the NSRI. A provincial winter readiness plan for the province is collated annually and submitted to the National Centre as well. We have representatives in the City of Cape Town's Flooding and Storms Task Team. This is a very important task team that they have established, where they have representatives from all role players, from all directorates in the City of Cape Town. The City of Cape Town and other municipalities throughout the province, they have standard operating procedures and contingency plans in place to address flooding incidents in their area. These plans include response and temporary shelter for affected communities, as well as the management of SGs. In this case, we have about 6 or 8 estuaries in the Western Cape, which require estuary management plans and mouth maintenance plans. And what that means is that when there are settlements that are near these near estuaries that require or who are facing an imminent flood, is that emergency breaching is possible of these estuaries to allow the excess flow to reach the ocean. Just one example of how flood management can take place here. Furthermore, we have an agreement in place with the Defence Force regarding the utilization of helicopters should the need arise. And besides the South African Weather Service, we have emergency medical services and the Department of Water Sanitation as key stakeholders as resources. Should we as a center be required to respond, the following arrangements are always in place. We always have officials on standby. We have standard operating procedures in place for the activation of our center or JOC, and which is always in a state of readiness should activation be required, 24/7, 365 days a year. Moving on now to the more proactive work around flood risk and how we can reduce the risk. This is now where my portfolio comes in. Is one of the key things we do is a hazard awareness program. Our flagship project there is the Fire and Flood Awareness Campaign Roadshow. The background to this is that it's an annual priority project of our government. It aims to raise awareness primarily on fire and flood safety, as these are the 2 most commonly occurring hazards that affect vulnerable people and communities. Drowning prevention, drought, and water security are also a permanent theme in the campaign. What the campaign primarily consists of is an industrial theatre production, and it performs a 30-minute play using acting, dancing, music, puppets, and our official mascot, Jerry the Giraffe, to convey and demonstrate preventative safety measures and emergency preparedness. In terms of the statistics, over a period of 10 years, we've reached almost 205,000 learners and 448 schools. We promote the emergency numbers from a landline 10177 and 112 from a cell phone. We always make sure that previously unvisited schools in rural high-risk areas are targeted. And the campaign always tries to maximize participation from all possible stakeholders at the local level, which include the municipal fire services, local disaster management officials, local media, environmental health practitioners, and so on. As I mentioned, media exposure is also key here, where we issue statements, we do videographies, we do radio clips, just to amplify the momentum and the messages of the campaign. Also, we provide supporting material to the schools that we visit in the form of pamphlets, posters, bookmarks, pencils, and armbands that contain the relevant information. So just to break it down a bit further, so the campaign's objectives are specifically to instill a culture of risk-avoidant behavior and resilience amongst communities. It aims to create awareness and equip pupils with basic emergency preparedness and hazard avoidance knowledge through the demonstration of various practical safety tips. It also, as mentioned, strives to educate learners about the emergency numbers, but also to know what to say when they are calling these numbers. And of course, very importantly, not to abuse these numbers in the form of prank calls. And of course, our aim is to reach all vulnerable and at-risk communities in the Western Cape. Very important part of this project is the monitoring and evaluation. Industrial theatre is generally a far more expensive medium to use to communicate messages than other traditional mediums. So what's important is that we can demonstrate that this medium is a worthy investment. And what we do is safety knowledge by the pupils is measured prior to the shows to establish a baseline of their knowledge. Then the message retention is measured immediately after the show to see how much they learned. But most importantly, when we return between 6 and 12 months either, we measured how much knowledge was retained again. And it has consistently demonstrated that this medium, in form of industrial theatre, as it has demonstrated the highest levels of message retention compared to other mediums. As you can see in the picture, when the show comes, the whole school comes and watches it. There's a stage where there's props and audio equipment and amplified sound, etc. Here's a picture. If you can see Jerry the Giraffe In the past, he used to be more on the sideshow, on the sidelines, but now he has become a central figure in the script, narrating all the key messages to the kids. Some further examples to show you what kind of schools we go to. We can go to schools where there's 1,000 pupils or maybe only 30 pupils. Here's an example of a typical rural school in the Western Cape, where we have to just always think on our feet to see how we can set up the stage. Where do we set it up? Is it in the sun? Is it windy on the day? And so on and so on. But this is a project that has really, I think we've all become quite passionate about it, because it's one of the few projects where one can see an immediate impact. Often when we are packing up and moving on to the next site, we can hear the kids singing and joking around with all the messages that they have just learned. You must remember, we use a lot of song and dance that incorporates the safety messages, as it's a better way for children to retain new knowledge. Just to give an indication of how we plan our campaigns, this is our disaster awareness dashboard. It's where we capture all our statistics, but also it's where we can overlay our hazard layers. So what you're seeing here is the Western Cape Fire Risk Index, or the fire hazard layer here. And the blue dots are schools. So as you can see, we target all the schools that are around the high risk areas, and we do similarly with other hazards. And this is a very good way to always know what your statistics are, what your planning requirements are for future campaigns, and so on. I must say, the use of dashboards, we've been able to develop these in-house, and we've developed a range of dashboards to monitor various interventions, most notably the long drought that we had here, which took, I think, about 4 or 5 years of constant interventions and coordination and management from our side. And this drought dashboard was able to always have a live data in terms of dam levels and so forth. So dashboards is something that's very easy or very recommendable to use in planning and response. Just to show you a snapshot from the decision support tool that we also use. So here's another. So now we've juxtaposed the fire risk together with the flood risk, and you can see these are the schools in that area. As you can see, the topography is also quite mountainous, which shows that there's always a high potential for some form of flooding along these areas where the schools may be. Just a quick example of what our pamphlets or supporting material looks like. It's aimed at kids. It's aimed to be practical. In terms of practical examples here, a lot of rural and low-income households don't have electricity, and they resort to paraffin and candles to illuminate their dwellings at dark. And this is just a practical example of how to safely store a candle in a jar half full of sand, and if it should fall over, the sand can extinguish it. When it comes to flooding, messaging is quite generic all over the world. It's basically to always be on the lookout for early warnings, to listen to the authorities, to head to higher ground, and to always listen to your radio or to the media for further updates. Furthermore, one can always do a form of family preparedness planning, to have something like a go bag, or to have your documents safely stored in a waterproof bag, documents like identity documents and passports and so forth. Here is an example of a bookmark that we give to children. It teaches them how to report an emergency to the numbers we convey in our plays. And this is an example of an A3 poster that goes up in every classroom. And then the teachers will maybe spend once a day just reminding kids about, the basic messaging that they have to always be aware of. Just in terms of some pictures of historic floods, as you can see, most floods are limited in the Western Cape to where our catchment areas and where our rivers are. And I must say, when one compares these floods to other global examples, most notably what's happening in Australia now, or what happened in Houston, Texas in 2019 with Hurricane Harvey, it pales in comparison. And in a way, we're quite fortunate that we haven't had such extreme scale flooding in our province yet. I think the last time we had extreme flooding, it was in the 1990s. It was over the Cape Flats that I mentioned earlier, which in fact prompted the process to the white paper and the green paper to draft the Disaster Management Act, which came out in 2002. In fact, it was a trigger point to start that legislative process. Here's some more pictures. Here's an example of an area that's where these are areas that are near floodplains or low-lying, and it's more of a form of ponding or pooling as opposed to swift water flooding that takes place here. Another example of that. So now there were many examples to draw from, but given the time constraints, I've chosen to just give a brief overview of what our most significant previous flood event was. It was in the form of a cutoff low storm. Normally our rainfall comes in the form of fast moving cold fronts during our winter season, but cutoff low systems can happen anytime from September, October, all the way to May, January. They are a much larger, slow moving system. And when they do pass over our province, they dump a lot of rain. So the Western Cape experienced heavy rain in November 2013, which resulted in flooding over 2 days over various district municipal areas. It resulted in extreme intense rainfall episodes causing widespread flooding over most parts of these districts. The National Disaster Management Center did classify the event as a disaster on the 9th of December, and this classification was then gazetted on the 30th of December. What that means when there's a declaration, it initiates the next process of where funding for emergency projects as well as recovery and rehabilitation projects can then start being allocated based on damage assessments that are conducted following these incidents. So just a brief situational analysis of what happened in the city of Cape Town. I'm just going to briefly go over these. It's mostly housing and road infrastructure damage. There was damage due to rockfalls and mudslides where there were passes on mountain passes or coastal roads. For the first time ever in South African history, we had a hospital flood where 127 patients had to be evacuated to other private hospitals. And I'm just going to pause on this point here, because this is a very, very important example of how planned development, any planned development needs to always factor in the prevailing risk or hazards of the location of the planned development. So it's something we are working very hard to ensure that municipalities include disaster management as part of the approval process when approving a planned development, be it a school or something private. And they do that by overlaying the risk assessment and also using their own institutional knowledge. So that for us was a very important case study. Furthermore, old age homes and caravan parks were evacuated. Social relief was provided to the affected communities by NGOs. There were electricity disruptions, light vehicle accidents, uprooted trees, as well as extensive damage to the private sector. Here are some some pictures from street cameras that shows you some minor flooding on the roads. Here you can see the water running literally through the ground floor of the hospital. Typical example of road infrastructure damage on the bottom left, and as well as one of the local police stations here up to about a meter underwater. Apologies for the low resolution of these pictures, but it's just to highlight what the first few emergency projects were. That immediately restored this bulk water pipeline, one of the key road passes, in fact, 2 of them, amongst other things. Here's some more examples of what happened in other areas, but as you can see, it's always related to infrastructure damage, road damage, electricity outages, even in this case, agricultural losses in the form of crops being damaged or washed away. And in this case, unfortunately, there were 2 fatalities. There was a car that was near a river or attempted to cross a river, and then it was swept away, and only 1 body, unfortunately, was recovered. Here's an example of the emergency rehabilitation work for a bulk water pipeline. It's not quite clear in the picture. Here again, just to show you further damage impacts. Here we had a prison that was cut off, and then the Overberg district, they had to provide rubber ducks to transport people across. And of course, again, extensive road damage, housing damage. There was even an unfortunate drowning that resulted in 1 fatality at a local farm. And then, again, various electricity disruptions. Just to give you a snapshot of the costs involved in the emergency projects. So I'm just going to look at the total. So for the 2013 event, which was actually followed by another cutoff low in January 2014. So it was almost a double whammy. But before that one hit, 50 million Rand went to emergency projects, mostly for infrastructure repairs. And then here, I just want to show you, and this is my final slide, I believe, what the rehabilitation and reconstructions costs just from the provincial departments, human settlements, transport, education, agriculture came to about 322 million rand. And then lastly, for the municipalities, it was around 100 million rand. So these two events, they cost taxpayer and the state roughly 421 million rand. I just would like to say thank you, but also I'd like to end off on just making the final point that when it comes to flood risk and specifically flooding, there's only so much I think we can do to mitigate, prepare for, plan and respond to a disaster. If we look at the levels of rainfalls happening in Australia, a 1 in 100 year storm, or when Hurricane Harvey hit America, just briefly listen to these statistics. Hurricane Harvey, 102 trillion liters of rainfall fell down. That's the equivalent of 400 days of Niagara Falls volume of water. It made a double landfall. It triggered 250 tornado warnings. There were earthen levees that were 70 years old, holding 500 billion liters of water, which were for the first time topping over. I think the overall rainfall from the hurricane was 1,318 millimeters. The impact size was the size of Switzerland, and it was also one of the longest named storms, which was 117 hours long. There were 29 record level river floods out of 53 rivers, and it was just not even in the peak hurricane season. And just to highlight how one simple bylaw or regulation can really make the difference. In Houston, there are no zoning laws. What that means, it basically is the reason why we saw a lot large industrial complexes, which were located near housing communities that were now inundated with flood water. There was obviously a lot of leakages of hydrocarbon and petrochemicals, and you can just imagine the situation from that point onwards. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over back to the program director.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. What a wonderful presentation indeed. Is there any questions that would like to pose to Mr. Adams? One question. Yes.
I see Kaboni raised one in the chat line. What role can non-governmental organizations play in replicating this fire and flood awareness campaign in the rural communities where drownings are prevalent?
May I answer it straight away, or are we taking more questions?
That's the only question so far I can answer it straight away.
So it's an interesting question. Normally what social relief NGOs or NGOs tend to do, they tend to do more relief work, and that's in the city of Cape Town area. But of course, they all are well aware of the need to do a lot of proactive work. In order to do industrial theatre roadshow campaigns, first and foremost, you need a significant budget. But the budget is obviously informed by the number of schools you want to visit and what the distances are between those schools. So most of the costs go to production as well as logistics. And if you want to know if you have to go through a tendering process like we do in government, you have to draft a set of specifications where you detail the requirements of the project, and then you get bids. We do have those specifications. We've managed to tailor them and polish them and improve them over the years to maximize the cost to it, and we often share it with anyone who's interested in doing the same. So if you would like to see an example of those specifications, feel free to contact me.
Thank you, Mr. Francisco. If there's no other further questions, just one question from my side. Is the process of developing the early warning signs the same throughout the country, or this is just only in the Western Cape?
Apologies, I was talking with my mute on. Thank you, it's a very good question. It is for the whole country. However, the Western Cape and the Gauteng province were deeply involved in the development of the new system and through various workshops and consultations. So yes, it is a national system, but it's also highly dependent on managing one's stakeholder relations with the regional South African Weather Service branches.
Okay, thank you so much. If ever there's no other questions, I would like to inform the participants that the presentations are going to be shared to all those who are in attendance. Next, then other hand, oh, Diasudit has a hand.
Okay, thank you very much, Msi, and thank you, Francisco, for the excellent presentation. I just want to make a comment that I'm unfortunately not going to stay till the end because I have a work commitment. Lifesaving is voluntary, so work comes first. But I just want to check with Francisco, what opportunities have, for example, provincial disaster management or even COGTA at a national level explored with sort of mobilizing, civilian helpers. For example, in lifesaving, we have lots of lifeguards who are trained in first aid and obviously in rescue swimming. So has the province or nationally explored that option on developing sort of auxiliary forces, if I can use that word? And I pause there.
Thank you so much for the question as well. I think in this case, this is where the volunteers come in. So part of the legislation is that local authorities have to try to establish volunteer units, volunteer corps. It's at the local level. And then the best example for that you would see at the City of Cape Town's Disaster Risk Management Center. I'm not sure, but I think they have about 100, if not almost 200 volunteers. They are obviously trained in first aid, basic firefighting, and amongst other courses, and they get used in various means from responding to incidents to running campaigns in areas to also support sporting events and those kind of things. It's something that is more at the local level. So the provincial centers their role is to sort of to guide and manage and coordinate and assist them to establish these volunteer units. However, in South Africa, as some of you may know, it's different to in North America or in Europe, where volunteering is something that's easier to achieve in the form of people who are already employed. A lot of the volunteers who are signing up to volunteers, they see this as a form of employment and expect stipends and as such. And unfortunately, that's not possible. But what does happen is that they are capacitated, they are trained, they're exposed, they are able to get experience. It even helps with their career pathing and so on. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next presentation, I will now hand over to Dr. Shayne as well as Adrian. But before I do so, I would like to introduce Adrian, just to read his profile so that you may be aware. Adrian will be a co-presenter together with Dr. Shayne. Adrian has 25 years in the fire and rescue service, including 6 years of secondment to National Resilient running an urban search and rescue team. He was part of the Chief Fire Office Association working group tasked to improve the water safety rescue services after the firefighter lost his life in the incident in 1996. This led to the development of national flood rescue standards for concept of operations for flood rescue through the Flood Rescue National Enhancement Project. Since then, on behalf of the CFOA, he has been the lead in running the water and flood rescue master rescues with colleagues in the USA from North Carolina Emergency Management and Kethlon Fire Department since 2004. In Lifesaving, he is now the SLGB National Operation and Safety Manager, where he has developed 9 flood SAR teams and developed the National Lifeguard Patrol framework for the coastal line in the UK. Recently, Adrian and his team worked in Tennessee to establish the SLA flood teams. Complementing these initiatives, is a member of the UK Water Safety Forum, advisor to the UK Research and Rescue Operation Group, advisor to the UK Search and Rescue Medical Group, as well as part of ILS Rescue Committee. ILS is Civil Protection Disaster Group. And over to you, Dr. Shayne and Mr. Adrian, for your presentation. Thank you. You may share your presentation.
Thank you, Ms. E. We're running a little bit short on time. How we set for time?
We still fine?
Okay.
Okay. Is Adrian going to share?
I'll let Shayne share if that's all right, and then he can take over. I'll take over from him. So Shayne opens up.
Okay. Play from start. Thank you very much. We'll try and get through. Our primary purpose with the first session tonight was, or this morning, I should say, is to actually provide a broad overview, broad introduction to, I guess, raise some of those questions. Some of those questions that have been raised is really where we want to get to. Obviously, what we can't do via a series of webinars is actually undertake the physical training, but what we're really aiming to do is improve the knowledge and the capacity of life-saving organisations, particularly Lifesaving South Africa, under Daya's request and passion, to be able to start to build that capacity, build those links to be in a state of readiness. So our first part of the presentation will be facilitated by Adrian. So I'll hand over to you, Adrian.
Okay, thanks, Shayne. If you just move on to the next slide, that'd be great. And hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. So the big thing I'd like to share is how do we deal with these threats, and what is the solution? And you know, very much as the previous speaker spoke about, flooding is the same throughout the world, and flooding problems and management is pretty much the same. And everybody's learned bits and bobs, but actually we've got to create a solution where everything starts to pull together. So the first thing is, the solution must be a system-based approach to disaster management and response. And by what I mean by that, that from the planning to the risk management, to the strategy, to the middle management strategy, right down to the tactical and coalface or people doing rescues, all that needs to come together in a very synced way in order for emergency management and responders, both volunteer and professional sectors, can work together. If there are gaps in that, then we start to put strain on emergency management, and we start to put strain on rescue response and evacuation systems. Next slide, Shayne. So what we've learned both in Europe and in Australia and in America is this, and it will be the same in South Africa, that when we have lots of hurricanes and lots of disasters and lots of rainfall, our systems for emergency call-outs are overwhelmed. And we need to deal with those and go, how do we make sure that information can be passed in real time, and real-time data can be made straight through the strategic decision makers right down to the operators at the front, and vice versa. So real-time data is really, really important. And making sure that we are not overwhelmed during these peaks of where we are now, and we can plan, as seen in the previous presentation, when we likelihood or high probability of disaster that may occur. Also, agencies and responders not capable or carrying out unsafe acts. And this is something that you'll see with our presentations over the coming weeks, that just having a whitewater rafting background or just having a life-saving background is not enough. We know that because the Americans have killed firefighters, the British have killed firefighters, and that's why the same thing happened in Australia. You've got to have flood rescue and flood disaster. It's different to whitewater, and it's different to what we do on the beaches. There are areas that come together and match very, very well, but the risk is different and the style of training is different too. lack of consolidation of mapping systems. And it was great to see in the presentation, mapping systems. It's really important, but not just at the top. Again, the strategic management of mapping systems and planning where those high risks are going to occur and match that against the urban risks, such as agricultural or industrial or population, is really critical important. It's also important as well that how often, you know, are those areas, how often it can take for access and egress to be affected. So a distance could be only 3 kilometers, 2 miles, and that might take just, you know, on a bicycle, just a few minutes. But in the flood environment, that can take over an hour. No systems to identify qualifying capability resources. So one of the things we've learned, and we'll show this in the next slides, is we call it team typing. Because in the old days, I would sit there like a Clint Eastwood movie Hollywood star with, instead of pistols, I'd have phones and whiteboards everywhere, because I would phone the one unit up or the one club up and say, what have you got? And they'd tell me they'd have a boat with a small engine. I'd phone another club up or another police station up and they'd have a bigger boat with a small engine, and the list would go on. It's really important to have a team type approach, that if I said, what is a boat team? Then they can tell me they have a boat team, and I know that list is in conjunction with the national standard, so I don't have to count kit. There is a minimum standard and everybody adopts to that standard. A reliable early warning system is critical, and in both in Australia with BOM and with UK and in Europe and in America now, we have early forecasting about 4 or 5 days out where we know the probability. And so we can give that. And that's really critical to doing what I call the low hanging fruit. Getting people moved early is much easier than doing rescue response. It is a pain because you might find those disasters move across the front and it's changed direction, but it's really important. It's better to move early than to push resources in. And very much like the previous speaker who did really well, a public awareness of hazards and risks. That is a big thing of changing culture. And we still see in everywhere that people get attracted to flood risk. And in fact, the media get attracted to flood risk. And so instead of removing the population or evacuating that, the risk goes up because people want to see the world end. So having an early warning system is really important. Next slide, Shayne. So I just want to highlight our problems in the UK, because there'll be the same problems in Australia and there'll be the same problems in South Africa. Guess what happened in 2007? Our 999, which is our emergency call system, was overwhelmed. There's a surprise. Partner agencies who respond to floods did not have a capability and were unsafe. And as you can see, you know, with the firefighters wearing those helmets, their helmets are designed to deal with impact, like a falling roof tile landing on their head. The problem is, if they fall into the water with that life jacket on, as you can see in that photo, that life jacket will inflate and actually cause neck damage because it will push up above the helmet and create muscle strain, or if worse, very much almost a spinal with the quick inflation of those helmets. So certainly everything that they wear and do operate has to be safe. A lack of consolidation of mapping. We didn't know what we didn't know then, and we didn't know when roads get flooded and when roads start to open up. And we had no system to say that who is qualified and who isn't qualified in flood. And the final thing is we didn't have enough air assets in place. Next slide. So what is the future? And we've heard a lot about the history of flooding and the history of this. Well, I can tell you it's going to get worse. To give you an idea of the impact of what's happened in Australia just recently, if you take the picture of the UK, the flooding of Australia is twice the size of the UK. And that has huge effects to what we see. The also big thing is how big is going to be big for us in the future. In America, they have a category of storms, and when Katrina landed, it was bigger than ever seen. It was originally category 3, and then it moved up to a category 4, which is the biggest ever recording back in 2005. Now we're starting to see storms bigger, and very much like Shayne talked about at the start, with climate and extremes and the temperature rising globally is going to have a huge effect. Next slide, Shayne. So going back to Hurricane Harvey, and just to give you an idea of what happened there, when we saw those hurricanes, we actually moved to Category 5, which is unheard of, never been replicated. And now recently after Harvey, where we thought 5 would be a very rare event, only 2 years ago, we saw 3 Category 5s, one after the other after the other. And for the first time, they're now planning in America a Category 6, a bigger super event. And because a lot of this now in the water temperatures, they now know that 86 degrees Fahrenheit, I need to work that out in Celsius, that with a storm cell starts to create the perfect mix for a storm. And that's all to do with this impact of sea rising. So what did that mean? Give you an idea of that Hurricane Harvey. Another shape to that is the whole of that country of Houston actually sunk by 4 centimeters through the weight of water. And if I drew a column of water that went straight up around that red dotted area, it would reach 2 miles or 3 kilometers into the sky. Next slide, Shayne. So I want you to start thinking about what happens now. We can talk about the history, we can go over that, but it's going to get worse. Again, Shayne has talked about this and showing that it is going to get worse. We are going to have huge storm surges, and we've gone past a first waypoint. Our first global waypoint was 2010, and we're still not planning enough for impact. Our next impact is 2050. Seas start to rise against coastal inundation, and the fact that the climate change will rise, that will start to have greater response to lower atmosphere rainfall and cause huge, bigger flooding. So the point being is, whatever you think now, you need to start thinking bigger, because by the time it takes to plan, and if I tell you that the UK took 15 years to get to this stage, it took America 15 years to get to this stage with flood response and flood defense. So if we start today, we're not going to get to the level that we hope to be until 15 years time. We are now knocking on the door of 2050. We're starting to lose historical knowledge, and the new people need to come in ready for the next wave for the 2100. So planning is started. You need to think about that and think big and bigger than you're already thinking. Thanks, Shayne. So with that prediction, we know that over 600 million people, nearly 10% of the human population, currently live in less than 10 meters above sea level. And by then, the cities are going to be mega cities effectively. And this is going to have huge impact for 2 parts. One, as you can see in the top right-hand picture, that the sea is getting warmer. And when we get warm seas and storm cells starting to be born out there in our oceans, then it's going to suck that water up and start to drop that somewhere. And that's going to happen more. And when I hear about a 1 in 100 or a 1 in 500, some of this data is now outdated. It's effectively magnitude over frequency. The size of the flooding is based on a frequency, and that frequency is based on a percentage that is designed, how often that might happen. So a 1 in 100 year flood could be in your area, just 2% chance every single year. But what we are looking at now is some of that data is so historical. And in the Western world, in Europe, a lot of that data came from 1947. It didn't have the data like we do now, where climate extreme is so much more. And so we're throwing these 1 in 100, 1 in 500 around. Actually, the possibility for a UK to have a 1 in 100 risk is not 2%, it's gone up by 6%. So it just shows you every year there's a 6% chance of having huge impact into your flooded area. Next slide, please, Shayne. So in Europe as well, just to tell you the problem very quickly, that even our countries in Europe are struggling with this, and huge amount of people are going to be affected. 250,000 people will be affected, if not 500,000 people will be affected in just 50 years time. And that doesn't sound, it might sound too far away, but it's not when you're dealing with emergency management and disaster preparedness. Thanks, Shayne. So your risk strategy, and this is the UK one that we were involved with in 2002, it just shows you where we see our risk in terms of population in the UK. And you can see the two red circles. One is coastal, right below pandemic influenza. There you go for COVID. But coastal inundation, and just further down is inland flooding. So two major risks that will have effect on your communities, people's lives, not just for the duration for the event, but the recovery event afterwards can take years to be sorted. Thanks, Shayne. And I just want to give you an idea of this picture here. This is a storm surge. The last one we had was in 1953, and you can see from this real-time data of the red surge coming through with wind and tide having impact on the UK and Northern Europe. And this was thought to never happen again. And actually, since 2007, we've been close to that on 3 occasions in the last few years. And give you an idea of that preparedness of thinking, we have a thing called the London Barrier, which sits on the massive Thames river, which protects the London city. And that was designed to come up once every 10 years to deal with such an event as you see on this screen. If I told you that's come up 27 times last year, it shows you how much of our world is starting to be affected by climate extreme. Thanks, Shayne. And that's just another evaluation of that picture. If you just click through the points on this for me, Shayne. If you just click on for me, Shayne, that's it, cool. So that immediate threat is 40,000 people now, if we have that threat now. Just a few more clicks for me, Shayne, thank you. Over 2 million people are going to be affected in the UK. And that's going to be 3 weeks of non-stop rescue and recovery. Huge amount of effort. And we've got to sort that out in a way where trained people that can work under and alongside emergency services. Next slide. So what is this for us? So in the UK, and it may answer Dyer's question about volunteers and able to do stuff. If you just click down to these points for me, Shayne, that'd be great, and I can speed up to catch some time back. 80% of the population would need to be evacuated. That would need 500 rescue boat teams, and we call this type B team. But the reality was, because of natural disaster and people want to watch the world end because they're excited, we could only get rid of 30% of the population. And so this caused huge amount of problems. And so what I'm going to make a point here is that where you think government risk may not be the actual point of where reality sits. Our risk assessment was based on 80% of people being moved, and in reality only 30%. So already from an incident that happened and storms in 2013 and 14, it didn't match the government risk assessment to the outcome. So we need to be aware that advice may need to be changed. Thanks, Shayne. So how many rescue teams do we have right now? We've only got about 100 right now, and that's because we still need to keep developing. So this goes into the point about what we're doing in Europe and Australia and UK and about team typing. And this takes the headache about what have you got, what qualifications you've got. And people that are assigned to a criteria, they tell them what they want to assign to, and this all suddenly makes life really easy for emergency response. So we have here 4 teams, an A, a B, a C, and a D. And I'm going to concentrate on the B team here, a water rescue flood boat team. It has expertise in technical water rescue. It has search operations within the water environment. It has a powerboat rescue operations, in flood operations, and they're trained in flood. So they're not trained just in beach or first aid or stuff. They are specific qualifications in line to operate as that boat for flood disaster. Next slide, please, Shayne. And this is a breakdown of what we have. So instead of me thinking I know what I need as a volunteer unit or a professional unit, actually every single team in the UK assigns to this criteria. So under a boat team, a type B team, There's a capability, there's a logistics requirements, a team structure, the competencies of training that are required, and then about how to transport, how they're trained in first aid. Decontamination is really important because it is a hazmat or hazardous material or biohazard event, and it tells you what the boat's capable of, the kind of personal protective equipment you should be using, and the technical rescue equipment. Now, this is the minimum standards of equipment that would be assigned to a flood rescue team. There can be more, but this is the minimum, and this helps structure very quick decision-making in emergency preparedness and disaster response. Next slide, Shayne. So why can you respond, both volunteers and professional services? Just clicking through these for me, Shayne. So we've got community that understand water, and lifesavers do understand water really well. It's one thing I'm very aware with the life-saving world is their ability to read water, with a great respect to some fire services who generally have been land-based for a long time, do struggle, but they do get there. But you know, we're very good at what we do. Carry on, Shayne. Keep going. We understand a bit about risk management, and we certainly understand about first aid and so forth. The point I want to make is why you know, you need people like this to work alongside the emergency services, because the emergency services also have to deal with other jobs. There are still people getting injured. There are still fires going on. There are still road traffic collisions going on. And so they can be overwhelmed, but a volunteer service trained and supported can make a huge difference in helping the response and helping provide communities with good service. Next slide. So why are we in Europe and in the UK and in Australia creating this, both rescue teams and civil response? Well, it's interesting now, this came out on the picture here, that UK's future flooding risk, we can't win the war against water. Very much like the last presenter made his final point. We're not going to win this war. It's all about mitigating as much as possible as we can do. And, you know, we can spend 90% of our flood budget on defences, but that may not be enough. And it may be that we need to think about 10%, if not more, in rescue response, where a little bit of kit and strike force teams, flood rescue teams, can do an awful lot of good when the world goes horribly wrong. And certainly we're seeing in America and in the UK that we're now not going to spend more money on coastal defences, because at some point in the next 80 to 100 years, they're just going to get pounded and over the top. Thanks, Shayne. So I'm going to ask you now is, as a group of people there, is start with management. The very start, basic fundamentals and foundation stones before we get down the road of tactical and rescue and boat work is about making sure that everybody's managed properly and how we prepare that. And I'm going to introduce Shayne now to carry on with this presentation, but it starts here and coordinating. And the point I want to make is, you don't want to find out who the emergency fire chief is and the emergency police chief is and the disaster manager person in charge and the volunteer lead on the moment when it goes wrong. You need to be talking, and you need to know first names before it starts, that you know the relationships before the event. Because if you don't, it's a really hard part of building that and trust in making decisions that will affect communities in a very quick time. Thank you for this, and I'm going to hand over to Shayne.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm not sure. Oh, no, I'm not muted, so I'm assuming everyone can still hear me. I think that's a great introduction, because I think one of the things I've learned, even from talking to our flood planners and local government, have all the mapping and all the other details similar to Francisco's presentation. We have a tendency to go with what is the given. So in our environment, we have police, we have fire and rescue, we have emergency service or civil service volunteer groups. Then you have the Red Cross, you have the agencies that will provide the relief areas and evacuation centres. And then there's a general area called the community, and the people that are joining in this and the passion that's been shared with us through Dyer and others that have participated to date, is that we have, as Adrian's highlighted previously, the skills and capacity to be more than just bystanders who are standing around. We have some capacity that if there is some basic coordination and a little bit of training, we can actually be able to help to cease or to put an end to the likelihood of being overwhelmed, albeit with the idea that we also want to be able to have ourselves responding in a safe manner. And as we already saw here in our country in the last week, we had some support that came forward, but in terms of the hazard that comes from flooding, I'm not sure that we were actually in our best possible position, given that drowning prevention is our catch cry. Anyway, the scope in terms of the thing that does bring a lot of this together, because Adrian's talked about the Americas, Europe and Australia. Obviously, we're only part of what's been now initiated through the United Nations, known as the Sendai Framework, coming out of Japan. It was about a decade ago. They had done a lot of analysis and put together this overwhelming disaster risk reduction. And from this tool or this framework has been applied and the challenge being sent out to each and every country, not only in terms of their own capacity, but also in terms of their neighbours. Because as Adrian said, and as we've seen in our country only in the previous cycle with the bushfires, we had agencies from all countries around the globe coming to try and assist with the fact that our country was burning. So that the priorities there are very much about priorities that are, again, as Francisco mentioned, we're talking about the state level, so local, national, regional, and then globally, how we are able to respond to the 4 priorities, and that is understanding the disaster risk. And I think even from their own experience here in yet again a claim in actually a decade ago, we had 1 in 100 year flood situation here. I think most people are now, and even in the New South Wales example this last week, the media was reporting 1 in 100 years. By the end of the week, they've changed it to 1 in 50, because I think there's recognition that they're coming more frequently, and the likelihood is that it's going to continue. So understanding the disaster risk certainly helps with all our planning, all the mapping, but are we engaging with all those aspects? Just strengthening our disaster risk governance, that's really where Adrian finished off just previously, in terms of how we actually manage and interface. So if we're an organisation that's got all this capacity, are we being approached as an organisation, and are we being able to offer a range of services, including the capability, putting together those lists, putting together the skills and qualifications of people, and how we then have that interface and the communication strategies that go with it. Number 3, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. The challenge in a lot of that is actually also putting the message out. It's not just a public response. It's not just about public bodies investing in it, because ultimately, if we're not prepared and we don't have our resources in place, then it hurts everybody. It hurts the government. It also hurts our private sector. And then the main message there in priority number 4 is build back better. And that's that whole idea, and that's what we're seeing now in post the rain events that we've just had, is looking at the infrastructure and building back so that we don't have to continually do it each and every time there's a water event, rain event. So what we're seeing, we were really wanting to reduce the global disaster mortality, reduce the effect on people globally, not just in the countries that we've been focusing on, reduce the direct economic loss in terms of gross domestic product, and obviously that damage to infrastructure, which we cannot continue to keep replacing over and over again. So we're seeing that with the strategies and the priorities, that there is an increase in the number of countries that have put in place the sort of systems that Francisco was outlining earlier, and that's a positive. And I guess as life-saving organisations, no matter where we are, one of the questions that's fundamental to all this is, what is the situation in our own country? Do we have a disaster risk reduction strategy? Are we being involved? Are we being consulted? Can we contribute? Substantially enhance international cooperation, and I think Adrian's work is probably an example of that, because he was sent to the US after Katrina to learn from the Americans. That's been applied in the UK, and then now he's also sharing that with some of the training and developments we've been part of here in our own country. Increasing the availability and access to multi-hazard warning systems. I got tied up on that one. I almost sounded like a siren. So again, that early warning and being able to manipulate and get their resources into the right place. And like many of the countries that are represented here, as Adrian mentioned about the actual area of flooding that's happened here, as a large country, it's very, very difficult sometimes to get resources in the right place, in the right time. So it's important to be able to prepare and use what we've got collectively. So like any sort of a plan, this is why we see it as multi-sectoral and having a very clear definition of what the emergency management situation is in our own area, having a vision that we can all understand, appreciate and interpret as its impact on our own community. And whether you're on the coastal fringes or slightly inland, there are still significant work to be done in developing what our mission will be and how we can apply those principles that we've already outlined here this morning. So one of the definitions is really about creating a framework so that we can all be able to respond to and reduce any vulnerability and to be able to cope with disasters. This is some of the work that Adrian was allowed in the country before COVID-19. And this was some work done in our far-flung state, Tasmania, at the bottom of the continent. So our vision, ideally, we want to be able to promote safer and less and improve or reduce the vulnerability of communities, and to be able to then cope with whatever hazards and disasters might come our way. Part of the mission is very much about our communities. The lady in this image seems to be quite pleased with the support she's got, but as you can see by the, sorry, Adrian? No. So our emergency management must be comprehensive. We really want managers to consider and take into action. What are the hazards? What are the phases that will go into that? Some of this we will explore further as we go through the webinars. We do have existing focus, but we're obviously keen to.
You get scared when you're up here. No, I'm not cross your feet.
Oh, Mohammed's having a great time. No?
And put your arm.
So in terms of the topics, we are looking to progress into the 4 phases. We are looking at hydrology. They're things that have come through that also relate to a management perspective, also down to a tactical response. So there's some of the things that we wish to explore as we go through, but we're also keen to learn from people filling in or providing their survey response. A progressive emergencies manages all about anticipating future disasters. And so to be able to be future looking, that's going to require those networks to be built, to be strong, and to be involved in having those discussions. We've seen a fair bit also this morning around the risk and analysing those risks and how to prioritise the risk, both our examples from the previous speakers. So there's no doubt that we have a direction on what we need to be able to do. And as we know quite well in our own instance, the need to have integration is so critical. We know there's a hierarchy within the governance of emergency management, but then we also need to have the equipment, as Adrian gave a small example of. We need to have equipment that everybody can use, understand, and be confident is actually capable of doing the job that's required. So building on that collaboration is not going to happen as indicated previously by picking up the phone or the radio at the point of the emergency. We need to build those collaborative frameworks and networks very, very quickly, and then have the capacity to synchronize and know that we've got confidence in moving people and knowing that the people that are in those positions are able to affect the necessary reactions. And as we've seen here, flexibility. Unfortunately, we had one of the drownings that was reported. We had a young fellow who was here from Pakistan, probably had some knowledge, but ended up in the river and was on his cell phone to emergency services for over 30 minutes. Unfortunately, it was not enough time for them to locate him, which highlights that, again, somewhere in there, our communication and our capacity to locate and respond has been affected. So we know in all organisations and in the examples Adrian's provided and Francisco's provided, I think we have a lot of confidence in the professionalism, both of the voluntary networks that we're all part of, as well as the paid individuals. So preparedness starts here, and thank you for your time. As we mentioned, the survey, at this stage, we're looking at further up to another 3, just depending on the feedback we get, starting on the 15th of April, the 6th of May, and the 27th of May. And once we receive all the information, we'll be able to collate and provide that information out to everybody. And thank you very much for your time. And sorry it's gone a little bit over. And I will stop sharing the screen and see if there's any questions or anything else to add.
Thank you, Dr. Shayne, as well as Adrian. Any questions from the members? While the members are still thinking of the question, I have a question. I wanted to find out from you, Adrian, as well as Dr. Shayne, including you, Francisco, is there any technological tools that are available to actually to gather the real data, especially when these incidents are actually happening? I'm talking about more of the so-called data science kind of a tool that will assist to gather the data, especially when the incidents are occurring, the real-time data.
So, Mizzy, there's a really good stuff being out in the United States right now. And if you want access to that, I can speak to those guys out there. It's a really good tool for disaster management because it plays out in real time. So it starts to model out where the risks are against the weather pattern. And as we start to funnel down into the disaster, the beauty of this is it puts in modeling of what will happen as the probability goes up or down. And then the nice part of that is the first responder, whether it's fire, police, or ambulance, or civilian volunteers, they have access to the app and literally using their mobile phone can video and show real-time data, and that gets uplifted into the system. And so strategic and middle managers can take that information and the reports and see real-time information to make real-time better decision-making. And it all funnels into right down from roads being lost or made, population movement. It's a very clever tool. It's the first time it's ever been used, and about 2 years ago. And if South Africa was interested in that, I can probably link that with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, because they would gladly help out. But it's a blooming good tool for allowing both emergency management, flood disaster management, and understanding the risks faced, and just coordinating much better.
Oh, thank you for that. Francisco, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Yes, I would just like to echo what was just mentioned now. The Western Cape Disaster Management Center, we have fortunately been in a position to finally purchase our own information management system that has the similar capabilities as just mentioned now. Spatial representation of incidents from dispatch, call logging, the whole recording of an incident. However, at the same time, there are so many global consultancies that are currently developing very, very useful local scale, fine-grained flood modeling software. And I think that would be the next step, especially from a development planning point of view. It can do long-term planning, factor in climate change, variations, and so forth. So technology is key in this regard. I'm a firm believer in that. I feel not everything is data-driven or evidence-based, especially in the risk profiling space. It's still very subjective, and going forward, I think, it is very important to invest in these systems. And just on that note, when it comes to disaster risk reduction, one of the things we often have to demystify, that it's not an added cost or a burden. It is in fact an investment in sustainability and resilience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any questions? Helen, in the chat room, is there any question?
I don't see any questions. I just see a lot of comments saying thank you very much for the very informative presentations, and that it's a huge opportunity for a resurgence in civil awareness. So yes, thank you very much for the comments in the chat line.
Thank you so much. If there is no any other question, I would like to thank all the speakers who have embraced us with their wonderful presentation. And indeed, there's so much work that still needs to be done to make sure that all the collaborating efforts actually takes a meaningful stage. And I would like to thank you, Dr. Shayne, for being spearheading all this, and from the start, starting from the conceptualization of this particular webinars. And I'm aware that there's also other webinars that are going to take place, as well as to our local man, Francisco, who have came forth and do his presentation and provided some informative information. And I'm sure a number of other local municipalities or representatives within South Africa and even within Africa will be able to learn a lot, and probably they will be contacting you for more information as far as how they can also start developing their own processes as well. I see that Shayne Baker's hand is up. Shayne, go ahead.
It was just a thumbs up, actually. Just endorsing what you're saying, mate.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Thank you. As well as Adrian, thank you for informative information that you've also shared. And to all the members that we've also attended, this is not the last webinar. There are 3 more series that are going to come up. You will be invited accordingly. And we want to say thank you again for attending. And we hope this was fruitful, this was meaningful, it was informative, and all of you will be able to get some information as far as what you need that you will be able to use within your respective countries or districts or municipalities. And with that being said, thank you so much for attending. I don't want to waste you any more time. And we were supposed to finish at 11:30. Now it's 31 minutes past 11. Thank you so much. I would like the presenters to stay behind while other people are enjoying their tea, lunch, and breakfast, whatever it is, irrespective of your country. Thank you so much for attending.